Right, back on the flat track motor. We're trying to make make sense and head to tell of how the oil circuit now works. Now it's had the modification. Okay, so I think it's probably best to try and understand how Yamaha did it first, and then we can then understand what's been changed. So with that in mind, let's have a look at okay, we've got an oil pump mounted just the other side of this cover, and these shapes, if you like, for want of a better, are all different stages of the chambers. Okay, so in essence, if we turn it over, in essence what we have is two oil pumps inside this engine. Okay, we've got two oil pumps. We've got the pressure pump for the workings, and then you've also got a scavenge pump that when the oil's done its work, fell to the bottom. The scavenge pump, originally this we're talking about, would have then sucked up that oil and sent it back up to the in-frame oil tank. Okay, so there's the scavenge pump, as I say, and the actual pressurised pump, side of the pump that pressuриses the crank, the main bearings, the big end, the gearbox. Right, okay, it's going to be difficult to do this because I've had a little bit of look of what goes where and how it goes already, but sometimes to try and explain it on certainly on a film and like live, if you like, is a bit of a, but we're going to have a go. So at times I'm going to take the camera off this tripod, we need some detail, so just bear with me on this. Okay. Right, okie dokie. In fact, I'm going to want a little bit of a if we can see in there, just bear with me 2 minutes again. We'll get a little block, get a little wooden block, and then we're going to make the job a little bit better. So I'm going to prop my cases like this. Okay. What we've got, if we look at the oil pump, is, forget these for the minute, this chamber here and this chamber here. Let's just concentrate on this here and this. Okay, between these two that go into them chambers that I just showed a minute ago at the back, then we have the bridge across here. Okay. So back to basics with this. The crank's turning clockwise as we look at it. This end of the crank is spinning clockwise, which means it's meshed to the primary drive, which is obviously now having to spin anti-clockwise. So, which means that the gear on the oil pump is meshed to the back of the primary drive, which means the oil pump is now turning clockwise as well. So with that in mind, let's just have a quick look at what's going on. So with our oil pump, what we get, trying to do it one-handed again, we get, this is how it came out, but this is not strictly correct, not in, but anyway, we'll leave that for the minute. It had a mark on the back of the inner, the small one. It had a mark on the outer one, and they're not together. Now I don't think it's super critical, but if you put it back together, you'd put them both so that they faced each other. That's just my take on it, that's all. But anyway, okay, so we've determined that the oil pump turns, the oil pump's going to be turning now clockwise. Right, so if we can zoom in a bit of detail, if we watch here at this point here, okay, so if we're watching at that point there, we're going to start this here. Okay, as it's turning, it's getting bigger. Forget all the rest of it. This bit here is actually getting bigger, as is the next one behind it. It comes from nothing, okay, to bigger, as do they all. Okay, so that means that this port size is constantly getting bigger, which draws, suction if you like, draws, okay, the oil up into here. Now remember, this is the scavenge side. It's just, you're just going to have to bear with me on this because we're going to have to flip from one thing to the other. So as that is now getting bigger, let's say in the chamber behind it, in there, and to here, we've now got an area, as I bring it round there, that is trapped, just there. So now we've got an area there that we've got some oil captured in there. It's got nowhere to go. The physics lessons, you can't compress a liquid. So it's now in this chamber here. So as it carries on going round, still behind it, they're getting bigger, these chambers behind it. So now as it carries on moving around, this chamber is now going to get smaller, but we've got a volume, let's say, I don't know, 2 cc of oil, or whatever it is, X of oil in there. X of oil now, because the chamber's getting smaller, is now starting to get pressurised, and it then pushes it into this top area, which is in there. Okay, so you can kind of see that happening as it's drawing from this bottom chamber, capturing it in this side here, and notice there's no gap there, but there's the biggest gap is that side, capturing it there and bringing it across to this side. So with that in mind, let's just have a look. Take that back out a second. So with that in mind, and that bit, let's take that bit out as well. So here's our chamber at the bottom that was getting gradually bigger. Okay, capturing it in here and then sending it into this top half here. Okay, so to understand this, we need to turn the casing round now. So let's do that. So looking again in here, now there's our bottom port that was constantly getting bigger, and then above it, next to the actual shaft, the drive shaft, that in at the back is the upper port. Okay, so what's happening is, let's start at the beginning. So if we can see this casting through here, through there. Now if I get my, let's try that one, get my screwdriver through that hole. He says, hang on. Just, I'm going to put it down a minute while I do it. In there, the end of the screwdriver, which is into the bottom of the oil pump. So when the plate's on, that's a sealed separate little chamber down here, down through, take it out, all the way down to, hang my screwdriver up, all the way down to, so it comes in here, all the way up, into there, across here, and into the back of the oil pump. Forced around the oil pump into this upper section here. Okay, now that would be this port here, which would be the oil return pipe. Okay, return pipe back to the oil tank. Okay, so there we have the simple circuit of whenever there was any oil down here, it would suck it up and send it back to the tank. So with that in mind, there's our little sump, and to kind of prove the point, that corresponds with this hole. Okay, so there's the hole that goes back to there, and then the oil intake holes here and here. In between there's a strainer. So this side of the strainer now, this chamber here, area here now, is, when it's on, if we just rest it on, is oil as it's been used and dropped back down, scraped off by the crank as we've mentioned before, scraped off here, and then ducted into this little catch area here. Okay, that little catch area there is, that's this side of the strainer, hence all the bits of old big end in the bottom. Through the strainer, into these little holes in here, there, up the hole, up there, into there, and into the oil pump. Out of the oil pump, up this original port back out into the oil tank. Okay, so there's the scavenge side of it. That's the first part of it, the big pump, if you like, which is this one. Okay, this pump. Okay, that's that. So we now know that the purpose of this little port, this little shape here, which is to feed oil into the pump. Okay, and we now know the area here that's covered up by this plate, when he's on with the arrow up, because obviously that seals it and makes each one a separate chamber. So there we go again, into the pump, out of the pump to here and out. Okay, I'm going to come back to that side of it in a minute. So there's the actual scavenge side of it. But before we can scavenge any oil, we need to supply some oil, don't we? You know, we need to get some oil in. So where did that come from? I hear you say. Okay, notice this. This bung is not Yamaha fitted. This should be a hole all the way through there into, we'll come to in a minute, into the back of the second stage of the oil pump. The little slot bit that we talked about. But before we do that, let's just have a look at if we can keep hold of it with oily gloves. Now, originally, your oil pipe on your XT500s has a little curved thing here, little pipe here coming down, bounce around here onto there, I think, and then comes from the bottom of the oil tank. So essentially in and in. That's the feed for our pressurized, our oil that's about to do some work. Okay, it's been sent back to the tank by the scavenge pump, but we actually need it here in the first place. That makes sense. So here we are. It's had a little plate on here with a pipe in the middle, feeding oil down that hole there into, let's turn it round, the corresponding there. And now I'm just hitting the bung on the back where the oil inlet would be. Let's call it the oil inlet. Okay, so there he is, the oil inlet. So you may have noticed that that's been cut off by a grinder. We'll come to that in a minute. There's the oil inlet, which as that case then goes over here, goes onto that bung, as we said. But this has been bunged off, right? Okay. So the pressurising side of the oil, how does he get an oil feed? Because A, we've got no oil tank, and B, this is bunged off, as is here. So what's happened? What's been over there a minute? Right, what's been happening here is, let me get this so we can try and get this so we can see it. I'm hoping that's enough to see it. Now we said from the scavenge side. So remember, if we've got a volume of oil in here, i.e. we've wet sumped it, this scavenge side that's picking up here and sucking up and going up through here and into the back of the pump will always have some oil in it. Now, as I said, the purpose of the scavenge side originally was to suck it up from the bottom, basically to clear the engine of oil. But anyway, it's now sucking it up and pumping it into this chamber here, which was ready to send it back to the tank. But now we've got a block off. What it's done, someone has drilled on the mod, has drilled a hole through there. Okay, that in Yamaha, or I don't believe that's Yamaha. Somebody's drilled that, which goes into this. So, I don't know if that camera's going to pick that up. In fact, if I get my torch, we can actually prove it. Just wait a second with me. Let me get to my torch. Right, so what happens if I shine the torch down there? You should be able to see that. Okay, so what's happened is, instead of it going back to the tank now, up there, and up the pipe to the tank, they're sending it through there into this chamber, which was originally a pressurized chamber by Yamaha originally, to actually using these little holes here to spray onto the gearbox. So remembering again, we've got a level of oil in here now, so the gearbox, the train of thought is the gearbox doesn't need an oil spray on top of it because it's running in oil. Okay, splash effect. So there we go. So we've had a grinder go in and chop off that section there, which meets up with that section there. What we've got now is pressurised oil coming out of here and not going out of there, as we said. Try and stay with me on this. Not going out of here. On the scavenge side, it now goes into there and through there, which essentially, because that now doesn't match that, will just poof out of there. Okay, that's quite a big hole, that, to do that. But also, what there is this is where it really is quite awkward to portray it. Up inside where the oil returned to the tank back is a hole. I can just get the end of it there, that's been drilled. So what we're getting is, when the plate's on and sealing this up, we're getting a pressurised from the scavenge side of the pump, and instead of it going out to the tank, as I've said, it's coming down there into here, and it's also going up there a little bit into a hole, which the hole is into our original gallery that would have had the oil pipe from the oil pump tank on. So what it's done, the big pump in essence, instead of sending it back to the tank, the big pump is feeding the small pump. It's feeding the small pump down there. This is the inlet for the second stage of the oil pump that goes across the pump and out and into there, into this gallery here, and comes out of here, okay, and feeds the oil filter, and then out the oil filter back up to camshaft and through here to the main bearings. I know it all perhaps sounds complex, and perhaps I've not portrayed it very well, but in essence what's happened is, to put it in a nutshell, instead of the back to the tank, the cases have been modified that the scavenge pump then feeds the actual oil pump that's to send oil around the engine's bearings and workings. Okay, so the scavenge pump is literally feeding the oil pressure pump. So good idea, yeah, perhaps, yeah. I mean, I get it on the, I get the idea of it. So that's essentially what's happened. Now the bit, you're supposed to not have an opinion, are you? But the bit that I'm not sure of, or I don't quite like, is when I look at the chamber here to feed the oil pump that's going to send oil to all our workings. Turn the casing back. It's fed from here, so as we said, it goes through that drilled hole into here, and also up there into our little gallery at the back we just looked at, that feeds the the oil pressure pump. Okay, but if that is just an open bleed off, I know that the scavenge pump is a bigger pump than the actual oil pressure pump, so if it was sealed up, we could have a situation, I think, where we could be sending more oil to the small pump than it can handle. So would you then need an oil pressure relief valve, etc., etc.? I possibly think that's maybe why what they've done, or the idea is what they've done is they've chopped that section of case off to bleed pressure off there. But what if we bleed too much pressure off there and none goes up to feed the oil pressure pump, to feed the big end and the... That's my... How do we know that by chopping a section of case off there, we've I mean, are we sending, if you're trying to put it in a, are we sending 95% of whatever this scavenge pump has produced out of this bleed off hole? Essentially that's all it is, and a little bit up here into this to feed the oil pressure pump. How do we know quantities? That's my only personally here. Well, I was going to say I'm going to stick my neck out. I'm not going to saying I'm sticking my neck out, but personally I would have thought, okay, I get the idea that the scavenge pump could be sending too much oil to the oil pressure pump if we didn't remove some somewhere. I mean, imagine like these jets coming out like a friggin' hose pipe because there's that much pressure in there and going to the pump. But I would have thought that perhaps not quite so big an orifice, maybe a restrictor in there, maybe like a grub screw set in there with a hole down the centre of the grub screw, that it could bleed off some pressure, but it would predominantly send the scavenge, you know, the scavenge side of the pump. Because remember, the roles have changed here. So, I mean, our main oil pressure pump now is not drawing oil from the bottom of the cases. Our oil pressure pump that's pressurizing, that's giving oil to our working components, isn't drawing oil from the bottom of the cases. It's taking its supply of oil to pressurize from the scavenge pump that is drawing oil from the bottom of the cases. So it's kind of a handover, a baton job, if you get what I mean. The scavenge pump's brought it up into the pump here, and then the scavenge pump is essentially sent it over to the pressure pump within the housing. This is the modification. But because the two are different, let me show you the difference. There is the rotor for, that's it, for the oil pressure pump, as opposed to the rotor for the scavenge pump. So we've got a difference there of. It's difficult to even actually put that in the same. Yeah, I mean, it must be like 4-to-1 difference in. And there's the outer for that pump. Let's just get that right. And there's another mark again, as I said about marks. There's the mark on the little arrow on there and the little arrow on there. So there's our oil pressure pump. Okay. And there is our scavenge pump. If I can get that 100 in there. Oh yes, right. So we see the difference. So if he's feeding him, we have to bleed some off. I get that. But what I also get, or what I also know, fact, is this has had a big end failure. Now, did it fail because it was worn out, or did it fail as a lack of lubricant? No one will ever know, and no one's insinuating anything here. We're just discussing, if you like. We're just thinking out loud. Okay, so the situation we've got is that we've got a scavenge pump drawing oil from here, this size pump drawing oil from the bottom, where we've got a quantity of oil inside, sending it up through the cases to this pump. Now, I would have thought, as I said, there's a situation where that would supply too much to that. So you've got to get rid of some of it somewhere. So yeah, splash feed it over the gearbox or something, you know, like. So, so I think the idea's there, but I'm not 100% sure that that we know that just opening that port there is the required. The problem is as well, I think, is drawing up oil from in here is so aerated. Remember, we've got a crankshaft. I mean, we know the crank's here, so would the crank actually be hitting the oil? I don't know, but proper aerated oil going up into this chamber here that normally would be going off back to the tank. And I know it's aerated because the one that's just gone back, when you start it up, it's like froth when you see it going back into the tank. So Alright, it's picking a lot more air up than it is, you know, as much air as it is oil. But anyway, you see where I'm going with this. Is that enough? Now, personally, if this was my engine, experiencing what we've just experienced with a big end failure, okay, it's very difficult to actually pressurise a ball bearing, isn't it, because of all the gaps. You don't ever really pressurise these bearings, do you? I mean, you know, come on, argue it with me. How can you pressurise that with all them holes in? What we get is low pressure, high volume thrown at it, like somebody's chucking buckets at it, buckets of oil at it. That's how it lubricates itself. So, by bleeding most of the oil off from here over the gearbox and sending only, we're just going to have to call it X, aren't we, up the little hole into the back of the pressurised oil pump, then is the main bearing getting enough? That would be my train of thought. I'm not calling anybody, insinuating anything, saying anyone's doing anything wrong, anything, you know, this is an idea somebody's had to de-tank it, if you like, for want of a better description of its oil tank and have the oil in the engine. But you know, whatever your take on it is, I actually think personally I would be tapping that, because as the cases go together now, there's nothing to kind of compress against it. So putting some force there to make sure more went down to this pump to feed my main bearings and big ends. That's my and also the camshaft, because it's all on the same gallery. Once it's come out of this pump, it feeds the crank and the camshaft. Now, anyway, look, you know, well, I'm kind of waffling on here a little bit, but it's just, I suppose it comes down to opinions. And you know, whoever's done this, absolute fair play, and fair play for working it out in your head and thinking about how you're going to do it. Again, it's opinions, whether you think it's the right thing to do, or anyway, it all does come down to opinions. So, you know, and I don't get into that. I'm not here to do that. I'm just, you know, at the end of the day, I'm just reporting, if you like, if that's the right word, as I find, reporting what I find. So the last note what we'll do is, obviously we'll have crankcase pressure in here, and in this what we call a labyrinth, it's like a garden maze, I suppose, that pressure inside is building up, and the only way past that plate, which is going to marry up to that plate when the cases are bolted together, is through there, which is there and there, through, up, through the labyrinth, which is here, all the way up, and eventually through this little bit here, which would then go into, where are we with that, would then go into that, yeah, and then out the breather. So all this labyrinth area here is just an oil separator, essentially, to trying to get the oil away as it's around, and it's quite low, that actually, as well, isn't it? So, you know, that's the only device, just a chamber there trying to get the oil to separate from the air, so the air goes out the hole, the breather, and the oil stays inside the cases, which is just this, like I say, this labyrinth area. So anyway, there we go, that's what we've got. I believe the debris that's in this engine though. So anyway, as you can see, but yeah, originally on the scavenge side, it actually sent oil down here and into this bearing here and through the middle of the shaft. Was I just talking there and not? Down here originally, through the little jets to spray into the gears, and then down here through this chamber here where the clutch arm is, and then out and through the shaft. So, but like I say, because they've now thought, well, we don't need that to do that, because we've got a quantity of oil in the bottom and it's the amount of splash that we're going to get, We don't need to sort of pressurise a bit of oil out these jets here onto the gear, so that it's just been chopped and done away with. Back to that, me personally, I'd be blocking off a little bit of that, because obviously that just bleeds out of there. Yeah, it just bleeds out of there, and if the hole can't cope with what the pump's producing, then obviously some will go up and out that little hole and into the other side of the pump, which is going to lubricate. In fact, we need to perhaps just touch on that. So yeah, take it as read that the oil has now come into this side of this chamber, because with our main, we're going to call it our main, our scavenge pump has now fed into that at the back that we were talking about, and it's now going to come out here. So what happens there is it comes out of there, now pressurised. What normally would come out of there is just the oil up the pipe and into the pump from the tank, but we've now got a situation where the scavenge pump is feeding that. Hope you're with me with this, just following me with this. But so again, our plate now seals up our scavenge pump and keeps him, he's in play in there. So what we're now concentrating on is we've got a supply of oil here. So there's our supply of oil. We have to kind of, it's like a mirror effect here. So on this plate here, when that's on there, and actually that way round, as you can see, that area there, when I turn it over, when I turn that one-handed, when I turn that here over there, that lines up with this chamber here. So this is our pressurised oil from the scavenge pump now into here, and the same effect happens as it's turning. It takes it from there and puts it to there, which is, as that goes on there, okay, it now comes into this chamber, which sends it down there. So as it's now going down there, if we move our oil pump components, so we're now pressurised oil here for the engine's workings, for the cam, for the rocker arms, for the crank, for the big end, and everything is fed out of that chamber there. This is the all important one. Okay, so there it is, and the corresponding one at the back, I lay it on that bit of a block of wood now, is here. There's the slot. Okay, so there's the slot at the back into this chamber here. Remember, the plate's blocked it off, so it's just a chamber. So essentially it fills up in here, then it goes that way because it's been blocked off, and now it goes that way. Where's he gone? Ah, bloody torches. There we go. And there he is. Okay, so that chamber there that were lit up, there is the pressurised out through there, down there. So if we now come back again, I do apologise for it being so, if we now come back again, it's now there. We've now got pressurised oil from there, here. Okay, so it's now into here. That means the outer cover now comes into play. From the outer cover, it bleeds straight across through a little non-return valve in the cover, straight across through the oil filter here, all the way through the paper element filter, through the middle of the oil filter into the centre, and then into here. And then we have a port going up that way, as we can see, just not long enough to come out there. So we've got pressurised filtered oil now in here that can go up that way like the screwdriver, which is to the banjo bolt and out to the cam. And if that was just long enough, it would show it coming into here. And again, now in the cover, there is a port that exactly matches that in the cover when the cover goes on, and essentially the cover just ducts the oil straight up the centre of the crank, down the centre of the crank. There's drilling in the crank that goes up to the big end and feeds the big end. The big end is what failed. So let's just say, what if, just a scenario, possible, I'm not saying it did, but just if, what if not enough oil came down the crank from here, there wasn't enough, okay, back through here and into this, across the pump, because too much was bled off that open hole. Just what if? That would be where I was if this was mine. I'd think, right, okay, now what I want to do is I'm going to alter, I'm going to modify again, because there's no turning this engine back because it's had that much mods. I'm now going to alter this. The size of that, is it always a case of it's going to take the easiest route? Perhaps, I would say so. Perhaps, just perhaps, nobody's, you know, perhaps there's just a little bit too much going from there. Just out, because it doesn't tie up with that anymore, because it's been taken off, so it just bleeds out. There's still going to be an element of splashing here, even if it bled out and the gears are here and they're still going to throw oil up onto the conrod and what have you, but it does have an oil way on the conrod into the big end bearing, that it does have an oil way where it's fed. So, you know, I would prefer to have pressurised oil to the big end rather than rely on, it's all hearsay, it's all who knows. Like I say before, I am